Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today, we have Thim. He's a threat intelligence analyst, specialist in cyber, China, Taiwan, and ASEAN. And he'll be discussing with us relevant topics related to China's cybersecurity operations. By cybersecurity, I guess we're talking about not only China's own self-protection, but its offensive attacks directly and indirectly on other countries, including European countries such as Czechia and more recently the United States. We'll be talking about the various APTs, the Salt Typhoon attack that may have affected almost every American, in addition to overall over 80 countries and other related matters. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we get into the heart of the matter, could you tell us a little bit about your background? How did you get into this specific area, and how are you finding it these days?
Thank you for having me. I currently work as a threat intelligence analyst at Ericsson, which is a Swedish telecommunications company. Prior to that, I worked for 6 years for the Czech National Cyber and Information Security Agency, which is for the U.S. Listeners, it's a bit like U.S. CISA, similar functions, more regulatory power, I would say. Prior to that, I have been long engaged in policy analysis of China's foreign policy, regional policy in East Asia, China-US relation, etc. Me and cybersecurity, I myself don't have a technical background. My background is in political science. But I kind of somehow found myself working on cyber-related issues even before I joined the government, which was my first really cyber-related job. Because if you go back like 10 years, 10, 12 years, you suddenly start to having those reports on attribution of Chinese cyber activity against the US, against US allies. And For me, as a security analyst and with the background I have, it was really interesting to look into, okay, what's the motivation, how they do it, what's the guidance. And from sort of that standpoint, the behavioral aspects of cyber espionage sort of slowly traverse into the more technical aspects of it as well. And
Well, thank.
yeah.
Mhm. Well, thank you so much for that. So I'm going to start kind of with a basic question to introduce this issue to the audience. Um, so from your observation, how do Chinese APT operations differ in methodology and strategic purpose from Russian and Iranian cyber campaigns? Or are they really all that different?
Um, like that might be easy question and also complicated at the same time. They At this very moment, at this point of time, they are different on the strategic level. Russians, you see, employing all types of cyber-enabled operations, including destructive attacks that have actual, real physical damage to the IT infrastructure. Um, Iranians are interesting because they kind of Russia light in that respect. Some of the first really destructive attacks were against Saudi Arabia, and Iranians were behind it. Um, so uh, they utilize the sort of more destructive aspects of operating in cyberspace as well. China so far has been mainly driven by intelligence collection needs. So cyber espionage, plus of course, important part of the Chinese operation in cyberspace is intellectual property theft. Although we haven't seen that much of this aspect in recent years. That might be related to, Chinese own advancement in certain fields,
Mm-hmm.
so they don't necessarily have the need to go after those technologies. But I'm definitely not saying that they like stuff. We just don't see it. If you look at the discourse again, like
Mm-hmm.
50 years ago, that would be mostly about, intellectual property theft.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Now, that portion of stealing other nations' know-how is definitely smaller, but definitely not zero. So they differ, but the difference is really situational because at that very point when China starts to have more conflict-driven relationship with let's say with the US, with Japan, with some other regional countries, it doesn't really take that much learning and that much different approach to move from cyber espionage to destruction.
What about methodology? Are they similar to the employed techniques? After all, it's been said that Russia has had a hand in training hackers of its allies, including Iranians and Chinese.
Sorry, I missed the beginning of the question.
The methodology, whether the methods that they employ are similar or
Um,
different.
on the like especially on the sort of level of trying to get into the
Hmm.
systems of the victims, they don't differ all that much.
Hmm.
Phishing is a tactic or technique that everyone use.
Hmm.
I would say Russians are probably a bit more skilled in that area. What Chinese, especially the top Chinese threat actors, excel in recent years is to exploit vulnerabilities in software, especially in devices that sort of sits on the edge of the networks, and there are sort of like gateways into the uh, either enterprise or government systems environment. There's a couple of Chinese APT groups that become really, really good in exploiting those vulnerabilities.
Hmm.
So that's kind of their niche skill at the moment.
So, how does the Chinese doctrine of civil military fusion blur the line between state sponsored and ostensibly private hacking groups? That has stumbled investigators in recent years, but I'm not sure whether that conundrum is all that relevant, to be honest.
Um, I mean, kind of coexist, and the strategy or doctrine of military civil fusion, um, basically at the very basic level seeks to sort of integrate or use the capabilities of civilian sector for the needs of national or regime defense, if you will. Um, so there is element within the Chinese cyber, how to say, cyber power that we call cyber militia, which is basically some of those like are like permanent units, some are so like uh can be like formed ad hoc in the time of need. And these are basically civilians that would be that can be at any time called to support Chinese state in cyberspace. So they're sort of like capabilities and talent that are not on a day-to-day basis working for Chinese states, but they can be called upon. So that's one element of it. The other element of it, and again, it's not necessarily part of the military civil fusion, but
Mhm.
it military civil fusion creates framework that enables and encourages that. There is and we know it from a couple of leaks in from recent years, most notably leak from a Chinese offensive security company that's called iSun, that there is a ecosystem of Chinese private contractors
Mhm.
that that basically do job of cyber espionage, cyber intrusions for the Chinese state. This kind of like, in a way, explains some of what researchers have been wondering in recent years, but also complicates, for example, things like attribution, because
Mm-hmm.
suddenly you have these APT groups that sort of break the what we again, let's say 10 years ago, I would tell you most of the Chinese APT groups are region specialized. So this group usually just target Japan and Taiwan and maybe Southeast Asia. And then there would be APT groups that go after sort of political enemies of the state, exile groups like Tibetans and Uyghurs, etc. But now you have these private contractors that they didn't appear in past couple of years. They exist like since mid previous decade. Um, so it's not entirely new thing. It's just our understanding is of their operations is new. And they would be, for example, today they would be working for the Ministry of Public Security, which is basically Chinese police plus some counterintelligence work. Uh, 2 days later, they will be working on a project assigned by the Ministry of State Security, which is the primary foreign intelligence agency. And then they may be working for the PLA. So and every time it will be like different, for example, geographic focus. So basically, you will have like three main pillars, right? You would have a Chinese military and uh, mostly supporting national defense and military espionage goals. Then you would have a whole range of activities that's under the purview of the Ministry of State Security, and then you have like these in between groups that one day work for PLA and the other they work for the MSS. So it's quite interesting and quite dynamic environment.
Uh, Civil military fusion and this idea of private contractors has created a philosophical conundrum for Western law enforcement and politicians. To be honest, I'm a little confused why it's such a dilemma, because to me, whether you're a private contractor working for the state or whether you're a civil servant working for the state, if you're engaging in illegal actions abroad, the outcome is still the same. Moreover, if you whether you are a private company that makes profit for itself, or whether you also take but takes direction from the state, or whether you are a wholly owned state subsidiary. Um, Likewise, if you're producing products for export that contain espionage equipment abroad, or you're engaging in any sort of intelligence activity or other harmful activity, propaganda activity on behalf of the states. Likewise, from the point of view of the West, the outcome is still the same, and the state is ultimately the beneficiary. Why I'm saying all this is this dilemma with TikTok, with DJI drones, with assorted other technologies and apps linked to China in various ways have become a subject of intense debate in Western policy circles. Why it's so difficult to make, why it's so necessary to make the distinction about the level of involvement of the state when there's clearly a connection, that to me is a bit confusing. I bet that for China, it's almost a pleasure creating these levels of distinction without a difference and laundering its involvement through layers of conventions when it's very obvious that they're actually the puppet master of everything that happens.
Yeah, so let me divide it in two parts. On the
Mm-hmm.
level of like cyber intrusions,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, there's really no dilemma, and you can also see it, for example, from indictments by Department of Justice slash FBI. It doesn't, even like from the standpoint of international law, it really doesn't matter if that perpetrator is a private contractor or if it's a state agency. they are acting on behalf of the state, therefore the state is responsible. That's just, it's very simple, and there's really no degree of difference. On the level of various Chinese tech companies, yeah, I mean, ByteDance is probably not going to run its own APT groups, but at
Mhm.
the same time, it it as a company is liable to the very same rules as those Chinese private security, offensive security contractors. It it has obligation to support Chinese state intelligence collection or intelligence activity. It has a legal obligation. Although I would argue, even if there is not this like specific legal obligation, they would still be obliged because it's a party state system, and you simply don't oppose the party state, even if like they don't like hit you over the head with a specific paragraph of this or that law. But even so, there's clear like legal obligation for those companies if they are asked to support Chinese espionage, for example, other activities that the Chinese party and the Communist Party and then Chinese state ask of them. And it really doesn't matter if it's offensive security contractor based in Wuhan or ByteDance or other companies that are present globally on the market. So definitely. Uh, well, I understand like the dilemma because that's something kind of conceptually unusual for us because um, for example, Czech government has no power to ask Avast, or now the company is called Gen, to sort of conduct cyber operation on its behalf. That would be like very super illegal. So we don't, and we would not, and generally like private sector companies, the deference they have to give to the governments of the countries where they operate, where their headquarters is much less than, and it always needs to be sort of supported by some judicial decision than how it compared to the how it works in the People's Republic of China. So I kind of understand why the dilemma exists, but I also agree with you that at the end of the day, the difference not there really. Those companies, even if they are nominally private, are really just nominally private.
Of course, I understand that there could be a difference from a legal perspective, but we're not dealing with a domestic legal problem. We're dealing with an international intelligence doctrine and security doctrine, and that I think is something that uh, is more of almost a military issue or an intelligence issue than simply politics or law enforcement in the traditional sense. That's why I'm a little bit puzzled why so much goodwill is granted where normally that would not, this would be just
Mm.
handled as a matter of security and not a matter of business or simple legal violations. Um,
Let's stay with TikTok just for a while. The
sure.
company has been TikTok, ByteDance as the owner. They have been denying for years that
Mhm.
data are moving through China. Um, But eventually, when those like TikTok executives were speaking under oath, they had to acknowledge, yes, there's some like engineers in China can access, for example, personal data of TikTok users in Australia. That was like one specific case where they acknowledged that, and at that very point, when a physical person in China can access those data, that's the very same as if Chinese state can access those data. There's really no difference. So yeah, I'm growing a little optimistic in that regard. The sort of awareness grows,
Mhm.
and that uh, we have a better understanding that there really is not a much breathing space between Chinese state and Chinese companies.
Now, another issue that has presented sort of a conundrum for Western, I guess, security personnel as well as governments is Beijing's larger push to control critical technology supply chains. Now, one element of that that's become fairly obvious is the effort to essentially control rare earth elements and other natural resources in an attempt to stymie U.S.-led development of semiconductors and other technologies that are dependent on these elements. But there are other ways of infiltrating or controlling critical supply chains. To what extent is APT activity part of that push? And to what extent is commercial um, effort part of that push? Essentially, buying their way into Western companies,
Mm.
buying stakes and making it, creating conflicts of interest or controlling entire companies that are involved in the supply chain.
Well, the APT groups support that intelligence collections part of it, because
Mm-hmm,
even on like strictly uh, business level,
mm-hmm,
having intimate knowledge of what my competitors do or what this startup that might be interesting for me and I might have desire to acquire it, if they really like, if they what's their actual knowledge and what's their know-how, that's something that's very crucial. That's just as important as some of the state secrets. So Chinese APT groups support the sort of collecting intelligence part of it. And then either Chinese companies or Chinese like state-owned enterprises can act upon those information. They can identify companies to target for further exploitation. They can target, for example, technological startups that would be good to invest in or to like acquire. Um, So this is kind of this like sort of business intelligence element of that all. So yeah, this is definitely something where the Chinese APT groups have a role to play, and they do play that role.
I mean, it's funny enough, recently there was a big scandal over North Korean intelligence operatives infiltrating Western companies, getting hired remotely and then, doing the job once they get in. To what extent are the Chinese actors doing something similar? To what extent are they trying to create basically shell companies or shell identities to essentially gain entry into Western tech companies? And to what extent it's no longer necessary because so many Western companies do business in China anyway?
It's not really necessary, and
Hmm.
from top of my head, I don't know of a case like that.
Hmm.
Um, there are companies that are very likely front companies for Chinese intelligence.
Hmm.
Uh, some of those have been identified, and they usually like stop operate very quickly when they are sort of burned, where their identity is burned. But North Koreans choose this approach also because North Korea is under sanctions, and it is illegal for North Koreans to work abroad. Um, uh, Chinese citizens and Chinese companies don't have these limitations put on them, and so technically, a Chinese citizen can seek employment anywhere in the world.
Hmm.
North Korean cannot.
Hmm.
Sometimes, and the North Korean case is really peculiar in that sense that it seems that the primary goal here is financial gain, And then the secondary goal might be intelligence collection in cases if the employee, manages to get a job some place more sensitive. But they mostly do it to collect salary and give it to the regime.
There's been a lot of complaints in Europe about how excessive regulation allegedly stymies innovation. On the surface, that would make Europe less of a target for Chinese operations, given that the innovations in AI happen
Mm.
in the United States and et cetera, et cetera. Is that really true, though, or are we seeing some other interests that China has in Europe?
I I don't have that good knowledge of the regulatory space and in technological sector in the EU. I know it's sort of common trope. I I don't think that as with all of those tropes, there's probably some truth to it, but it's not like Europe or European Union is this regulatory hellhole where innovation doesn't happen at all.
Mm-hmm,
Uh, you can look at it from the other perspective and say that perhaps like the US technology sector could use some regulation because there's
mm-hmm,
almost none. And regulation as such doesn't really have to stymie innovation. It really depends. But this is really not not my field. So I didn't, probably if some people would argue, yeah, really Europe needs to sort of, cool down a little on the regulatory efforts. Uh, Although, uh, as it concerns AI, I'm kind of glad that Europe is more cautious in that area. It's also looking more at the security side of it. Um, a bit worried that we're sort of like opening a Pandora box that will be very difficult to close if we don't sort of attempt to, establish some regulatory framework early on. But I may have wandered a bit too far. So I think that there was also another question. So just remind me.
Yeah, yeah. I was wondering whether these alleged bureaucratic obstacles make Europe less of a target for China, or
Mm, I
no?
don't think so. I don't
Mm-hmm,
think so. And there's still companies like Dutch ASML in the semiconductor sector that's sort of
mm-hmm,
of prime interest to Chinese companies. So
mm-hmm.
there's I wouldn't think so. The technology sector in Europe is just as targeted by Chinese espionage as technology sector anywhere else.
Speaking of Chinese involvement in Europe, one of the biggest uh, developments recently was the Chinese cyber attack on in Czechia. So I kind of like to talk about that a little more because while it was a major, I would say in some ways groundbreaking development in the US, it received relatively little attention. And this is the first time that I'm seeing the China so relatively open as far as these things go,
Mm,
has taken its activity into Europe. I mean, it's not that we haven't had cyber intrusions into China, um, but those were mostly of the criminal variety. This is the
mm,
first time where you're seeing a more state level operational message attack,
mm,
and this is the first time um, that it's being acknowledged as such. So in a political context. So I'm
mm.
curious to see what exactly first of all happened, just to explain it for our audience, um, and mm, how significant is it as a case study in China's willingness to target smaller European states, and why would it be
Mm,
have an interest in doing that
mm.
um, at all, given all things considered?
So there's several developments that clicked in one place
Mm-hmm,
at the same time with the attribution of attack on Czech foreign ministry to Chinese APT group that is known as APT-31.
mm-hmm,
Um, Happened in May, end of May-ish. Um, First, it was indeed first time Czech government publicly made public attribution at this specific level. We
Mm-hmm.
have made Czech government made attribution in the past, but more like in an indirect way that you would see it
Mm-hmm.
published in annual reports.
Mm-hmm.
This time, the reason why it happened is partly bureaucratic in a way uh, because recently within the Czech government was approved the attribution framework. So sort of to explain it, is sort of like institutional process, how to approach, how to consult different like stakeholders within the government, and then present the evidence to the government, and then government decides whether it will go public with the attribution or not. And the process took a couple of years to formulate and get everybody on board. So there were Chinese espionage attribution, Chinese espionage intrusions that were older than that. But at the level of the government, we didn't really have
Mm-hmm.
well-established process how to approach that. And in the end, the attribution is a political decision. So this is one thing that happened, that they sort of like now a process how to attribute and how to sort of acknowledge that attack. So that will probably start to be happening, will start to be a more often occurrence, depending on the cases. Previously, Czech government usually joined attributions on the EU level, so we were sort of like, European Commission would say, I will say APT15 group targeted European ministries of foreign affairs, and Czech Republic would like voice support for that attribution. So this was like first time it was national. The significance of it that is that the intrusion is traced back to year 2022,
Mm-hmm.
and it was a year when Czech Republic held the EU presidency.
Mm-hmm.
And as a presiding country, uh, they they became, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which, as you can imagine, during the EU presidency, Ministry of Foreign Affairs is quite an important institution because it's a sort of the communication point through which all the communications with other partners in the EU goes, and communications with Commission, and talking about, presidency priorities before the presidency takes place, etc., etc. So that is why this particular intrusion was also significant. Um, and so it's to go back to the set of the questions you had. It's not necessarily about willingness to target smaller countries.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in this particular case, the small-ish, I would say Czech Republic is a middle-sized country, but let's say, from the Chinese perspective, definitely small. Was also motivated by the significance of EU presidency.
Mm-hmm.
But generally, I wouldn't say that Chinese cyber spies are like all too picky,
Mm-hmm.
uh, in which EU member states they get into. That the advantage of compromising, for example, foreign ministry of one member state is then that you can get your hands on a lot of communications coming from the other member states as well. And maybe you can sort of use that collected information to target another institutions, because now you have like inside knowledge, and you can, craft your phishing emails in a way that they will appear credible to the other party. So attacking one is, I wouldn't say just as, compromising one. Maybe it's not just as good as compromising all of them, but it gives you fairly good insight on discussions that are happening at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not necessarily, about whether the country is big or small. At that particular point of time, Czech Republic was a EU presiding country, and there was a lot of very important communication that was going through systems of Czech foreign ministry that became the target.
Would you say this development is going to affect the way EU views China? I mean, a couple of years ago, NATO, for the first time, acknowledged China as a threat. We have seen arguments over EV, over trade in general, and the EV dumping practices by China. But in terms of security, we're still seeing a lot of yeah, I'm not entirely sure that China is still being perceived as a threat, especially in light of the tensions with the United States over tariffs and
Mm.
other things. I mean, I see many European countries, Eastern European countries, doing business with China in various capacities. Does the fact that China is willingly attacking these countries on a state level something that is changing the calculus, or do you think there is still a long way to go before China is perceived as a real threat?
It's kind of in Europe with in regards to China is a bit of push and pull process. I
Mm-hmm,
would say it's like a bit like one and a half step forward, then one step back. So we're slowly sort of moving to what I would consider, better and proper understanding of Chinese motivations. But of course, or let me put it this way, like there's of course definitely a lot of discussion now, especially in regards to Trump administration relations with Europe. That's suboptimal. Uh, that you would see some voices and say, "Oh, let's we can't really trust the U.S. Let's just cooperate more with China." You can't really you can't really trust China either, and on completely all different level. I think those are usually not very serious discussions.
mm-hmm,
They do appear in public space, but on a policy level, I don't think
mm-hmm,
that's a serious concern. But of course, there's still well, first you will have countries like Hungary, and it's Hungary is problematic country in regards to EU's approach to Russia, but also to China, because it's I no longer work for the government, so I can try to be more blunt. It almost feel like Viktor Orban's sort of fetish to sort of approach those totalitarian countries just to show it to Brussels and his other critics to the EU. So he's sort of leveraging Beijing willingness to do business with Orban at the period of time where others are not so excited about it.
mm-hmm,
Uh, I would say more problematic in long term is something you still like see, although it's diminishing somewhat, but what I would call German approach. And it's like, yes, we understand that China is a trade and business risk and rival,
mm-hmm,
but it's not a security issue.
mm-hmm,
And that's just a fundamental misunderstanding of how Beijing approaches those issues. There is no division, there is no separation of business and economics and a political and security. So you can pretend like I will do business with them because that's non-political, and I will not really like talk about security issues because I'm not interested in those. Beijing has pretty much a holistic approach and doesn't separate those issues. So I would say even like Germany, that's sort of prime example of this approach, especially under previous governments, is slowly abandoning that approach.
mm-hmm,
But it's still a very strong view among some of the big German businesses, and those, of course, create pressure on German government to, behave accordingly. Um, so that's kind of these are kind of the influences that always makes us to sort of make that one step, half step back when we make one step and a half further. Um, but on a, even on a strategic level, if you look at the
Mm-hmm.
communication that European Commission issues in regards to relations with China, there is a ocean of difference between how China was approached like 6 years ago and how it is approached now. I think Commission is pretty much on the right course,
Mm-hmm.
and the member states eventually will, join in. And there are elements that are important for us, like protection of critical infrastructure,
Mm-hmm.
and then I think there's definitely more consensus. It's more, the problem is more like how to approach China as a security actor, because there is not a consensus on that. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but some of the like cyber espionage or trade or economic related threats, the understanding of those are better. We just need to sort of understand that there's not difference between security and economics, not in China's view.
Do you think Chinese cyber intrusions or attacks in Europe are likely to increase?
This is always questions that is a bit difficult to answer uh, because it's difficult to assess at what level they are now. And I will give
Mm-hmm.
like hypothetical example, right? You will have one attack in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
Then you will not discover any attack for next 3 years. And suddenly you have like 5 attacks in 2025. Doesn't mean like that it increased fivefold. Not necessarily, because one of those intrusions might be from 6 years before and we only
Mm-hmm.
find out now. So the popular answer to your question is it will increase, because it corresponds to what we generally see, that the Chinese APT groups are very active. Uh, if it's going to dramatically increase, I wouldn't probably say, because it's already pretty bad right now. So there's certain limit of activity those groups can reach. And I'm not saying that they reach that that they are like all exhausted and can't work more. They probably can, but it's not going to like increase like tenfold. And it will also very much depends how able are we to detect those intrusions. There will definitely be cases that we have never discovered, and so they don't make it to the numbers or to our like knowledge of what Chinese manage in a cyber espionage arena.
See any difference in the level of Chinese purchase or efforts to purchase exploits and also to recruit Western cyber experts?
They don't really have to purchase them,
Mm-hmm.
because Chinese state has like two ways of how to feed, especially zero-day vulnerabilities.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, One is the process of reporting vulnerabilities in the People's Republic of China.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone who's based there has a legal duty to not disclose vulnerability publicly, but submit it first to
Mm-hmm.
Ministry of Information Security and Technology,
Mm-hmm.
which sort of is the reporting place. But MOST, um, then so it's Ministry of Science and Technology, sorry. Then the practical work with the vulnerabilities is done by institutions that actually is a part of the Ministry of State Security. So to put it like in the most direct way possible, Chinese companies and Chinese security researchers have a legal duty when they discover vulnerability in software to report it to Chinese Foreign Intelligence Agency. Is the same like if there would be regulation in the US that companies and researchers have to report their findings first to CIA, for example, or to the NSA.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's one pipeline through which Chinese state gets undisclosed vulnerabilities, and the other is hacking competitions that are organized by um, some of the Chinese companies, but also a government plays role in it because it's funding some of those, or it's providing the financial rewards for the winners of those competitions. And it is also tied to a prohibition of Chinese security researchers to attend hacking competitions abroad. So they can only attend those that are organized in People's Republic of China. And that's another way. They're basically sort of it's like crowdsourcing of Chinese um, security researchers' talent to find vulnerabilities that would not, for example, make it to the through the first channel. So the first channel would be, typically, most of all the Chinese companies. So you would have vulnerabilities in their software. So it would be stuff like Huawei and Alibaba Cloud and
Mm-hmm.
Xiaomi, and you have it. Um, any of those like Chinese companies. The supply pipeline through the hacking competitions is basically everything else. So vulnerabilities in a foreign made software, in Cisco devices, in Fortinet devices, again, you name it, anything. So Chinese state through those two channels is sort of hoarding and continuously receiving vulnerabilities that are unknown to the if it's a case of the Western companies, they are unknown to those companies. If it's Chinese companies, they know about those vulnerabilities because they reported them, but they cannot patch them and they cannot disclose them. So they are essentially 0 days to be exploited by Chinese spies. So they don't, you know in a way, through those like competitions, yes,
Mm-hmm.
Chinese tennis sort of like buying 0 days, but it doesn't have to do it on a sort of like dark web marketplaces. It has its own supply system that secures them like continuous delivery of critical vulnerabilities.
What can you say about Europe's vulnerabilities to cyber coercion as a tool of statecraft?
Can you repeat? Sorry, I didn't catch it.
What can you say about Europe's vulnerabilities to cyber coercion, meaning ransomware or similar, as a tool of statecraft?
Europe's vulnerability?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't think that Europe is in this case more or less vulnerable than, for example, the United States. I
Mm-hmm.
don't think if you look at the big numbers of businesses or cities or hospitals targeted, for example, by cyber criminal groups, would be that different. Uh, Maybe it's even more prevalent in the US. That doesn't necessarily mean like one or the other is more secure. It's also a matter of financial reward, and where those, if we talk about cyber criminal groups, if they expect payout, it's generally easier to get a payout from American company because in some European countries that would, be borderline illegal, or there are like starting to be regulations in place that make it illegal. For example, in the United Kingdom. So in this sense,
Mm-hmm.
it's if you seek profit, U.S. company, I would say on average is more likely to pay the ransom than European company.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, so that I don't know if that like answers your questions, but
Mm-hmm.
I don't think like Europe is more or less vulnerable. It's kind of, especially in the cybercrime arena, we all are pretty much in like not very good place.
So, speaking of not a very good place, the recent Salt Typhoon um, attack, which was probably one of the biggest yet,
Mm,
um, indicates that that particular APT is one, a major a growing phenomenon, and two, there is an element of strategic patience that kind of sets some of these more successful groups apart
mm,
from brute force attacks that people may be more used to.
mm,
So, and also raises many questions about exploitation of third parties, vendors, um, situational awareness, and general preparation for this sort of attacks, general awareness of ongoing threats by companies and governments alike. So, what are some of the lessons that can be drawn from this scenario? How can what made it so what made Soul Typhoon so successful to begin with, and
mm.
what do you think is going to change going forward, if anything?
That case is very interesting also
Mm-hmm,
because we don't really know that much about it yet.
mm-hmm,
Um, so usually, typically, we learn about cyber campaigns when the investigation is over, and and there's like technical reports published, and you will get like at least the necessary details to make good judgment. In this particular case, the first one who published about Soul Typhoon intrusion, I believe, was Wall Street Journal.
mm-hmm,
Uh, which indicates that it was sort of a directed leak uh, during like ongoing compromise. Um, and sort of we like since then we were able to like collect like snippets of knowledge here and there, but we don't really have the full picture yet. It was fairly clear few months after the intrusion was revealed last summer, uh, summer 2024, that it's probably much worse than what the initial reports showed, and you know the developments since then pretty much confirmed that. We know some of the types of network devices that were compromised. So those were some of those like devices that sits on the edge of the network, and those were compromised. We know that in some of the cases, the Salt Typhoon was sitting there for multiple years, collecting information. We know that although like the focus is on the telecommunication sector, and pretty much every major ISP or mobile provider in the US was compromised by this actor.
mm-hmm,
Um, uh, then that but that's the initial focus on the telecommunication sector, but there are like other sectors and organizations that were compromised. It's possible that some of it was sort of like secondary victims, like we compromised this network but they realized how to find out way to, for example, other systems. There are government institutions that were compromised, right? National Guard systems were compromised by Salt Typhoon. There's a bunch of victims in Europe and East Asia as well. I don't really know what's was the sort of unifying lessons of it all,
mm-hmm,
because in a way none of it is really new. It's the scope that's really like scary. Um, the techniques that were used, the the way the group, at least from what we know so far, tries to sort of hide in the network. These are not like terribly new. Other Chinese groups use that as well. So they will exploit zero-day vulnerability in a edge network device, and then they will very often use functions and tools that are native to the targeted system to sort of hide their activity. So whatever they do looks like normal to detection systems, because these are tools that are part of the system, so and they don't behave like abnormally. It's just that the threat actor is using them to, scan the network and move around. Um, but that could be very difficult to find out. So Typhoon is not the only group that does that. There's a bunch of threat actors that utilize this skill. Uh, so maybe the lesson here is if you think something is pretty bad, it still
Mhm.
could get worse. And I, as much as many other researchers, are, sort of looking out for when we will have a like more comprehensive reports from at least some of the intrusions.
Mhm.
Um, that may for that we may need to be patient. But there are definitely like a couple of years from now we will have a like better knowledge of the threat actor. But we actually really don't know that much, except that the scale is really massive, that the techniques are stealthy, but not like entirely different from what other groups use.
Mhm.
Uh, yeah, not
Seems,
very satisfactory answer, but this is where we are.
I mean, it's almost like these APT actors are way ahead of the game because by the time their victims catch up to what they're up to, they're already into a new attack, most likely.
Hmm. Yeah, that's possible. And they apparently, collected a massive amount of information. The one thing that could be limiting on their end is if they're like able to process those information and utilize them.
Hmm.
But I would I would rather have that worry of having a lot of data as a sort of intelligence or spy collector,
Hmm.
to have a lot of data and figure it out to find the good information than not having those data. So Chinese threat actors sometimes do it. They don't necessarily collect with a great focus on something specific.
Hmm.
They will grab whatever they can and
Hmm.
sort of figure out a bit later what to do with that. I'm
Hmm.
not saying this was the case, but it very well might be, or might be a mix of it. That some of it was deliberate, and some of it was um, more opportunistic in a way. Oh yeah, we can also grab this, so let's just grab it.
Do you think this scenario will present a case study in basically how to compartmentalize sensitive data better or to keep more of the data offline entirely? Will it make Western countries more cautious, in other words?
I guess it should. Although, compartmentalization of networks is really like all those companies that were targeted, especially the mobile operators, should have like, network segmentation that should prevent threat actor from like grabbing whatever they can get their hands on. Uh, and they might have, we don't really know the whole scope of what type
Mm-hmm.
of information were stolen. So, uh, network segmentation, for example, allows that the threat actor is not able to move like around all of your enterprise
Mm-hmm.
network freely. And so you can hide your, like, for example, trade or intellectual property secrets. It doesn't look like so Typhoon would like get something really sensitive from the telecom operators as such, like from their operations and their sort of intellectual property. It was more about their clients and users of those networks information,
Mm-hmm.
and that might be the case, but it also might not. I I don't think we will learn something terribly new that we haven't already know, like
Mm-hmm.
rotate passwords and have two-factor authentication and segment network better than you have. There will probably be a bunch of measures that were supposed to be in place and were not. This
Mm-hmm.
is usually what it is. I don't think there will be like a eureka moment of, oh, we haven't thought about this. I think
Hmm.
it
In
will
other
be
words,
like, why you haven't had this in place
to begin,
already?
do you think that will actually, this particular incident will finally spur these companies and telecom operators to actually follow the basic security protocol, or do you think the same people will keep repeating the same mistakes? Um,
They would probably tell you that they already do that. Although, like, I don't want to name names, but there's one of the everybody can like look up. So I will not say name of that operator, but it's in public domain. There's one of those like major operators in the US had like what, five or six major personal identifiable information leaks in just as many years. So basically, like leaked like customers' information every year in past 6 years. So this is probably something not like working very well. Um, Publicly, those companies will tell you they do all of that and they take security very seriously, even though it doesn't really always look that way.
hmm One of the major issues with those operators was that uh, around 8 or 9 of them were basically part of the same, they were all basically connected.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, you have the major ones, right? And then there are like the smaller ones, but they use like the same infrastructure. They sort of
Mm-hmm,
rent out, they basically rent out the infrastructure from the bigger ones.
mm-hmm,
And yeah, that would like definitely be, for example, a case of AT&T, where a lot of the
mm-hmm.
smaller operators would use like, you know, um, network infrastructure that was built by AT&T, but AT&T is sort of loaning out for other operators to use.
Do you think from do you think what does it say about what does Salt Typhoon's success in that regard say about the vulnerabilities of global supply chains? If the telecom sector was so easily penetrated and so vulnerable, and those are the big players that have the resources to at least theoretically to protect their infrastructure and to take better measures, what could be said about supply chains where you have dozens of vendors and players with divergent levels of security in place? Does that mean that much more destructive attacks are potentially um, uh, are likely to take place?
I'm afraid so. I don't think there is like optimistic answer to that, especially because how complex the supply chains are.
Mm-hmm,
And there is like, you may have noticed there's another ongoing large-scale incident that involves service supplier called Salesforce, although it's not Salesforce that got compromised, but more like a utility that
mm-hmm,
integrates Salesforce services to other companies. And so at the sort of receiving end of that compromise are all those companies that lost that were of whose like personal information were leaked because some utility of that integrates another utility of this supplier um, was not secure enough.
mm-hmm,
And that's really like I wouldn't want to be that guy who's like a security architect in a given company because that's like endless source of headaches because you inevitably end up with, you don't have to be a large company, global company to have a fairly big number of suppliers that you really have to trust and rely on, but those suppliers also have suppliers, and somewhere in the middle of it is one that has a weak security, and the threat actor like find that one, and they are very good at that, and through like the trusted connections in the supply chain will eventually get to you, and you have done nothing wrong, and your primary supplier also done nothing wrong. It's somewhere like, up the supply chain where something bad happened, and it's from this like security standpoint of view, it's nuts. It's I'm not sure if there is a like really good solution to that. And especially, as I would say, especially in the US where the sort of corporate resistance to any types of regulation is very
Mm-hmm.
strong, is traditionally strong. It took like huge effort and like ages to sort of put in place some basic incident reporting
Mm-hmm.
requirements. So I don't even know if it already like is in force, but for years, even the like big companies with critical services didn't have didn't unless it, for example, affected personal information, they
Mm-hmm.
didn't have they have a legal obligation to report a major incident, even, for example, when they were really like sort of a critical service on a
Mm-hmm.
national level, which pretty much differs from how it works in Europe. Here, like the critical infrastructure entities have a duty to report incident. In the US, it hasn't been that case. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not, as I said, I'm not now sure if that regulation has already entered force. But it's like in this sense, US is like really behind. And since a lot of those companies on the supply chain are very often like, US based, we all have a problem because they don't have any. That would be wrong to say that they don't have any like sort of compliance requirements, but they don't have compliance requirements that would address like what they have to put in place in terms of cybersecurity. And uh, this will be a massive pain to attempt to fix that.
You know,
So
a lot of the critical infrastructure attacks in the US have been linked to Russian rather than Chinese
mm,
attacks, but I'm not sure that's going to always stay that way. I think China will quickly discover that uh, after the telecom disaster that this is something that is quite beneficial for them to do. And uh, we've had a number of incidents, from the colonial pipeline being one of the
mm,
most memorable to more recent attacks on utilities as well.
yeah.
To what extent is the critical infrastructure in Europe well protected from such penetrations?
Look, it's not the regulation that makes those like
Hmm.
systems safer. So I don't
Hmm.
think. Mm, First, difficult to generalize because cybersecurity is part of an national security, and there each individual member states may have different approaches. This is not something. There's sort of efforts to sort of put some common requirements on the European level, but then it really is a responsibility of each member state. Not something that can be easily harmonized.
Hmm.
So maybe it should in terms of critical infrastructure. Uh, I just because we haven't had a like similar incident, I wouldn't make the judgment that's in somehow critical infrastructure in Europe is safer than in the US.
Mm.
Um, Maybe yes, but it would be a really speculation. I'm not really sure I want to go there. Uh, we might as well like okay. we, for example, until now don't really exactly know what caused the big blackout in Spain.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to speculate that it was a cyber induced, but it hasn't been entirely ruled out. And the thing
Mm-hmm.
is that simply we don't know. And so if, and it's a big if this was confirmed to be a shut blackout that was caused by cyber means,
Mm-hmm.
and I want to just emphasize that at the moment there is like no direct evidence that would confirm that. But if yes, then if I told you before that I think critical infrastructure in Europe is safer than in the US, that one case would be enough to sort of like invalidate that statement. So it's difficult to say.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we might have, before Sol Typhoon, we talked about Volt Typhoon, which is intrusion that was like from 1 year before. And
Mm-hmm.
that is an actor that was basically that got inside critical infrastructure systems, including energy sector companies, and was just sitting there and doing nothing, waiting for the order to do something more destructive, maybe. At least that's the conclusion of U.S. intelligence community. That seems to be a logical conclusion. At this very moment, we might have like Chinese or Russian cyber spies sitting in our critical networks, and we just don't know about those. So I would be careful with making those judgments if something is safer in Europe than in the US, or the other way around, because there's a lot of things that even as defenders with the best intentions and the best information we have available, we simply don't know. Hmm.
To what extent um, should the Western policymakers recalibrate responses when APTs prioritize long-term infiltration over high-profile sabotage? And do you think they should be doing that at all? Is one more important or effective or disturbing than the other?
Mm, what do you mean by that?
Um, do you think there should be a different type of response for this
Hmm.
sort of long-term campaigns versus, big, quick hack and dump situations?
Yeah, so there's like two types of responses, right? At least how they were utilized. Sort of the identify, name and shame. That's
Hmm.
the prevalent one in the US, and that's also partly because US legal system operates a bit differently. Um, there's very often like indictments against those
Hmm.
actors. That's where US sort of stands out. In Europe, that's usually not the case. Uh, I'm not expert in legal systems in
Hmm.
Europe, but in Czech Republic, when police who would be like investigating the intrusion, if they find out that the perpetrator is a probably state actor residing abroad, they would close the case because there is like no one to prosecute. So those cases usually just get closed because we simply don't have uh, the enough information to, and there's basically as of course, we could technically, the Czech police could like go to go to Minister of Interior, and Minister of Interior could send like official request to Russian side that we have a suspicion and ask for cooperation. We can do those things, and sometimes it probably happens, but where do you think it will lead? Like nowhere.
Obviously.
So that's usually why those like cases are closed, because there's like no there will be no like successful prosecution. Um, um, so there's other approach that European Union has utilized a couple of times, and then it's to impose sanctions on
Hmm.
companies and individuals. I don't think that beyond that, apart from like sending like special operation forces abroad to like kidnap the perpetrators, and which again would be also like terribly illegal, at least from the European like sort of rule of law standpoint. So beyond that, there's really not that much we can really do.
There's been
Yeah.
two developments in the US that may change the dynamic depending on their success. First, private companies are shifting to a more counter-offensive approach. In other words, beyond simply taking defensive measures to prevent penetration, there will now be employing hackers, ethical hackers, to counter-strike against you know opponents, at least in ransomware cases or cases where there is a clearly identifiable perpetrator. So that's company level, that's private security. On the US government level, there are instances of cyber wars between NSA and Chinese companies, and in a rare instance a few months ago, such an episode was acknowledged or brought to light by the Chinese side. I don't know whether the European states are equipped to engage in that. I'm certain that this is would have to be a pretty high level incident for those measures to take place from on the state side, and that sort of escalation. But it is certainly a possibility.
No, you are right, and I failed to mention it. There's also those kind of instances, and there was a case when it was a joint effort of U.S. and NSA. I believe FBI was probably also involved, and then a bunch of like partners from Europe and from Five Eyes countries where and Czech Republic was part of it when. Usually, each of the countries operated within their legal within the section of the internet they have like they can legally operate, and the effort was to take down Russian infrastructure, Russian APT group hacking infrastructure. So yeah, those efforts do take place, and on a fighting cybercrime, there's definitely some notable successes where cross border, sometimes cross-continental cooperation, especially between Europe and the US, took down some major cybercrime groups, including like physical arrests that took place. It's a bit more difficult to use the same approach to espionage actors. Um, but there's certainly element of that works, and then when you will not really punish those responsible by these kind of operations, but you can make their life more difficult by imposing sanctions, destroying the infrastructure in cases where it's possible. So yeah, definitely these kind of efforts take place. And also, I failed to mention there is definitely like change of mindset that European countries, including Czech Republic, nowadays state we do have a cyber offensive capabilities, and we
Mhm.
will use them in case of defense. The conditions are specific. It needs to be reaction to attack that would sort of reach the level of military action. But yeah, there is a like the, it was almost like 10 years ago you wouldn't like see that discussion about like having offensive cyber capabilities. Now European countries openly acknowledge and develop those capabilities. So there's definitely like a shift in both like policies and legal frameworks, but also mindset in Europe on that area, and that in some special cases we do operate offensively.
There is one dimension in all of this that is really not well discussed at all, and now it's come to the surface because US has made the very bizarre decision of not fighting disinformation by Chinese, Iranian, and Russian groups. The
Mm.
dimension I'm talking about is how cybersecurity intersects with information warfare. So I kind of want to take a look at how the Chinese information warfare machinery sort of integrates cyber espionage with propaganda, censorship, and influence operations, and what is the impact of this hybrid approach?
So the way China approaches it is that it is all part of information warfare.
Mm-hmm,
So sort of information warfare is that the sort of higher concept within which cyber military operations, cognitive operations, or disinformation operations, depends how you want to call them. All of that is part of information warfare. So they have a sort of, again, holistic approach. And these kind of operations is a type of warfare that Chinese state deploy not only, it doesn't have to be in a state of war. So a lot of these elements we see, is being deployed, even though China is clearly not in open military conflict. So at first, it's all integrated.
mm-hmm.
It's part of the same sort of framework. It's all information warfare. You may want to remind me some of the more specific questions you had. So I sort of lost.
Um, yeah, I was just curious about the integration of these methods and what impact do they have, basically. How
Um,
impactful is the use of this hybrid approach of using cyber espionage, propaganda, censorship, influence operations in achieving China's state
mm,
objectives, especially against European countries, but also in general, more
but
broadly?
China definitely starts to, and it has started years back. It's not that new development. Start to look into a Russian playbook.
Mm-hmm,
Um, Chinese, even like online effort and online propaganda. If you look, if you look like, not that far back, was mostly focused on creating some sort of positive image of China,
mm-hmm,
while we know that the Russian approach is sort of more destructive and corrosive. It's not about we are the best. It
mm-hmm,
doesn't really try to convince the world that Russia is the best place to live and the Russian political system is like model for everyone, as Chinese still do. Uh,
mm-hmm,
it's more like don't trust anything, everything is bad, like really like sort
mm-hmm,
of corrosive nihilist, even like almost nihilistic approach uh to life and all. um Chinese in some ways start to sort of learn from those. I would say they are still learning. If you look at the even some of the large scale information operation that are being tracked, if we use like traditional metrics like engagement on social media, they don't seem to catch that much attention.
mm-hmm,
So by which we can also judge the impact is not terribly high uh, or effective. Um, because for example, like um, type of information operation that was aimed at Latin American countries on X, back then Twitter. Um, and the levels of engagement like was very, very low. It was like sometimes only double-digit numbers, which is almost nothing. Some other campaigns are have more engagement, but again, really quite low compared to some of the known Russian efforts. So I would say China is learning. It's struggling a bit. Um, but when they learn, we will have a really big problem because at the point where China is going to willing to cross sort of red line and start to be really sort of in a narrative meaning start to be destructive and corrosive and sort
mm-hmm,
of start to play more effectively different parts of society in the target countries against each other, at that point we will have a problem because Russians will not stop doing that, so they are already on it.
Mm-hmm.
Now you will have another like major player trying basically do the same. The only thing I would say that holds Beijing back is that has it still can hope that the sort of positive messaging that channels through like official state propaganda will win them friends over, so they don't have to like play dirty in
Mm-hmm.
their like cognitive operations. But at the point when will and that's specifically, for example, like their engagement in Europe, or of course, when we come to issues like their efforts in Taiwan, we are already there. Like that's pretty much Russian playbook happening there. It's just that the the effectiveness over there is um, is limited by the general awareness of, for example, Taiwanese populations that the way Chinese they have been they have been sort of having this narrative war for a very long time. So the effectiveness is limited for different reasons than in Europe. But so what I'm trying to say, Chinese are already have like use cases where they deploy this sort of like destructive narrative as opposed to the positive win-win cooperation propaganda run directly by the Chinese state. When they decided for some reason it doesn't work in Europe that well, and maybe instead of like trying to win some countries over, it's time to punish them, and they start to sort of play the Russian method or Russian card in their cognitive warfare, that might get get ugly. We're not there yet, though. China still has this like it's in much different place than Russia, right? It really has some. Russia basically has nothing to stand on when it tries to sort of formulate positive image of its own. I I would almost say that Russian don't wouldn't really believe it. Um, but China has some fundaments of uh, sort of formulating positive message for the rest of the world, despite all the like horrible human rights abuses, etc., and the, persistent cyber espionage and other things. So that's where the China doesn't really have to go the Russian way yet, if that makes sense.
Now, finally, to end on a positive policy note, US has been obviously on the retreat in counter disinformation space, but does that create an opening for Europe to take the lead in building counter disinformation networks, or will that gap remain unfilled?
Yeah, the development in the US is interesting, right? Because now you have like people in position of power who sort of came from the backgrounds where countering disinformation is something that the deep state does, and they have very hostile attitudes to it. And then, since they are in a position of power, those like measures are being removed. Uh, Europe, I'll give you example of the Czech Republic. So 4 years ago, when the current government was a new government, it has like plans and ambitions to, create like a national coordinator for countering disinformation, creating
Mhm.
some like at least some semi-permanent intergovernmental body that would deal with the disinformation. And in the end, nothing really happened. Problem, and I would say that would I, I honestly don't know how that like applies to the rest of the Europe. I should think that some countries have are in a better situation than others. But essentially, we kind of deal with the same problem as the US in a way that it's kind of disinformation operations. They exploit what you would call First Amendment rights, right? So
Mm-hmm.
to like counter them really effectively, the European countries would have to restrict freedom of speech, and this is really not. I mean, we do it to a larger extent in general in Europe than in the US.
Mm-hmm.
There are some speech that is forbidden. For example, like you can't really advocate for Nazism.
Mm-hmm.
That would be illegal in most of the European countries, if not all. Uh, so there are some like free speech restrictions, but you know, prosecuting people because they, for example, push uh, hostile narrative of different countries would is a step a bit too far where uh, most of the countries don't really want to go, and most of the governments, and it would be also controversial in terms of like elections.
Mm-hmm.
Because usually some of those disinformation narratives, at least some of the political parties that are competing in elections, they sort of use those narratives as well, which is of course a problem in and of itself.
But
Um,
wouldn't it be viewed as foreign malign influence, as interference? And if there is a monetary or coordination, collusion between
yeah,
domestic political actors and foreign intelligence agencies, wouldn't that be illegal? Not under some new, authoritarian framework, but under existing laws.
yeah. So that's what I was like, sort of very slowly and in a complicated way trying to get into. You usually need to connect the dots with
Hmm.
something else, with the people who spread this information. If it's just the speech, there is really no case.
Sure.
There might be in cases when you can say, okay, this is like actually like promoting racism, and then we have laws that would make that illegal. On the other hand, those sentences are usually like, very low, and
Hmm.
uh, police very often like declines to prosecute those cases because they would become like overwhelmed if they deal with each and every case when somebody says something,
Sure.
racist on internet. That would probably just clog the justice system. So you need to, yeah, as you said, you would need to make a connection. Like maybe you get like you are financed by Russian embassy, and you are colluding with the foreign interest. I think there is a not I think that there was I just don't know the specific. There was a law approved a couple of months back in the Czech Republic that would make it easier in some of those cases, especially if those like disinformation narratives would be connected to the activity of foreign intelligence services. So baby steps, but generally we will always be at a disadvantage. You wanted to end up on a positive note. Say the positive note is that we like we are not going to limit freedom of speech
Hmm.
unless it's really, really, really necessary in a small number of cases. But that also means that we will always that's just a natural part of the system we live in. We will always be at disadvantage against like totalitarian states trying to exploit our freedom of speech against us. And of
Here's the irony of it. The irony of it is that I'm observing personal, and if I'm observing it, so are many others, a rising number of outright provocations and false narratives
Mhm.
about European countries allegedly limiting freedom of speech. And this kind of works against you both ways. On the one hand, Europe cannot actually do that, even if they are more aware of the United States of the threat. The hands are still tied. But on the other hand, the bad actors are still exploit that not only to advance their own narratives, but also to create false perception that it's actually the European Union, it's
Yeah,
Brussels that is,
yeah,
the anti-free speech warrior
yeah,
here. That's the irony of that.
yeah,
That
exactly.
it's still, even if you're not doing anything wrong, it's still the perception matters more than the reality.
Yeah, 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 that's it's insane. Um, yeah, I wish to end up on something like like saying we have a solution for that. But we don't really have like one single solution. I think some of what could help is that the verification or identification of disinformation with tools like AI and like even
Mm-hmm,
before AI, just the sort of verification will become a bit easier and
mm-hmm.
it'll be easier to expose like, outright falsehoods. Um, Yeah, so that might like help the situation, but I also don't really want to live in a society that would just outright restrict speech because a few bad actors abuse that.
No, no, I don't think there is a need to restrict speech. I think there is a need to become more persuasive in advancing your own arguments and being able to do that better and to appeal to with something concrete and positive rather than nihilistic and self-destructive, narratives. That's the problem. What I'm
Yeah,
seeing now, the big issue is not that these actors are, making advancing their arguments, because their arguments are not all that great, but and not all that appealing, but that they're making it seem like the West can't advance theirs or isn't even trying to. That's the
yeah,
problem here, that West has nothing to offer and to negate anything positive that happens. That I think is the real problem.
yeah, yeah, sure.
Thank you so much for this
Thank you for
interesting
having
discussion. I hope that international cooperation in understanding, encountering these threats and engaging in best practices and keeping, basically creating sort of a voluntary network that keeps each other honest on implementing security protocols is something that can help make it more difficult for bad actors, whether from China, from anywhere else, to exploit the system, to exploit the problems. And I hope one day the tables can be turned. We can become more effective at identifying these actors and essentially kind of getting to them before they get to us.
Yep.
Um, Thank you.
I mean, just because it looks like hopeless,
Hmm.
it doesn't mean it is hopeless, and we just, everyone needs to try the best to make things better. And in that sense, I'm optimistic.
Thank you so much for this discussion. For everyone watching it, we'll be back on the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio next week, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, as usual. And thanks for tuning in. Thank you, Michal. This was
Thank you.
this was
Pleasure was
fantastic.
mine. Bye bye.
Bye.